Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about maple tapping, or tapping maple trees for to make syrup. And so let's jump right in. I'm going to share my screen with you and get started. And okay, so this is an image of a bunch of large maple trees that are being tapped. So the most commonly and widely known type of tree to tap, of course, is maple trees, and the sugar maple is the one that people tap the most because it has the highest sugar content, which is about 2% sugar. And 90% water in the sap that you get when you first tap the tree. And the goal, of course, is to concentrate that sugar to up to about 66 or 67% sugar. And if you get higher than that, you can start to get sugar crystallizing in the bottom of on the pan or in the bottom of the syrup. And in maple, the primary sugar is sucrose, and there are small amounts of glucose and fructose, but sucrose is the primary one. And there are other trees you can tap, including other types of maples, black maples, which have similar sugar content to sugar maples, and also silver maples and red maples, which have less sugar, about 1.7%. And those two also bud out and leaf out sooner than sugar maples. So you get less per syrup per amount of sap for those. You can also tap box elders, which are in the same genus as sugar maples and other maples, the Acer genus. And you can tap other kinds of trees as well, like birches. White birch has about 1% sugar in the sap when it comes out of the tree. And the yellow birch has a little less than that. And birches are becoming more popular in the state of Vermont anyway, with some commercial operations that have been started in the last decade or so. And other types of trees you can tap are walnuts and beeches and hornbeams, which are very small and tricky to tap, I believe. And so we're going to jump right onto our next slide, which is starting to identify some of the trees you can tap. So maples, you can see here, sugar maple leaves look like this. And leaves, of course, won't be out when it's time to tap your trees, but they're an easy way to help identify a lot of trees, including maples and birches. So one thing you can do is identify them in the summer when the leaves are out and mark them in some way that doesn't harm the tree, so that later on, when it is time, the next spring, late winter or early spring, when it's time to tap the trees, you know which ones you want to tap. So sugar maples are here. Red maples are here that I mentioned, in silver maples. Norway maples are here, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. Striped maples and mountain maples are small and not really good because of their size for tapping for sap. So sugar maples are the most common tree tapped. This is a good explanation of identifying the leaves. These three main portions on top, two smaller lobes here. They're not finely serrated like the red maples that we'll see in a minute. These mature, two pictures here are mature trees with their bark. When they're smaller, they're smooth, much smoother bark. It can be tricky to differentiate from other types of trees, especially other maples, which we'll see with the next slide. Here is red maple. You can see it doesn't have the big or clearly defined lobes are on the bottom here, but it is finely serrated and is pretty easily identified. These two images here show mature red maple trees, and which are a little bit different than most sugar maples. And here you can see a slightly smaller one with very smooth bark, although it's pretty big. So you can see it would be a little bit tricky, or could be tricky to differentiate from a sugar maple just by the bark. So especially if you're newer to identifying trees, identifying them in the summer when the leaves are out, which makes it much easier, than marking it in some way would be good, a good way to do it too. Silver maples have pretty distinctive leaves, and this is a mature tree, has very shaggy bark, especially when it gets really big like this. Norway maples the leaves look very similar to sugar maples, although if you look at them side by side, you can see the difference. And the bark is a good way to differentiate Norway maples, because it looks actually kind of like ash, but it's very, I think of it as very neatly furrowed like this, instead of shaggier or flaky like sugar maple, red maple, and silver maple can be. And birches, if you want to try birch syrup, although we'll get into some of why birch is trickier and harder to do. If you want to try it at some point, white birches are very easy to identify by their bark. These are some white birch leaves, and yellow birch, also known as golden birch, and paper birch is also known. White birch and paper birch are two names for this tree, and yellow birch and golden birch are this one here with slightly larger leaves than the white birch here. Now getting into the actual process of tapping and then boiling down your sap. These are some examples of taps that you might encounter when you go looking for them. I personally have used ones like this and like this. They both work pretty well. This year I used some like this. I didn't use the ones I have like this. The one advantage to this plastic type like this is that it takes a smaller hole in the tree to get this in and working, so it damages the tree ever so slightly less. And when you drill the hole, which will be between 5/16 to half an inch, depending on the type of tap you use. It is actually damaging the tree slightly, but it's a minor damage that will, in a healthy tree, will heal up pretty well. And so using you can use a power drill or a brace with a bit in it, angling slightly up like you see here, which will help the sap come out of the tap. And these are also called spiles or spouts. Angling it will help it come out slightly more easily and into your container, whatever container you're using to collect the sap. And in terms of the size of a tree, that's fairly important. You don't want to tap anything really less than 10 inches in diameter, even a healthy tree, because it's not mature and it might damage it more than it would those mature trees. So one tap per tree for certainly 10 inches to 18 inches. If it's 18 inches or larger and healthy, especially if it has a really good sized crown, you can put 2 taps in, a fair distance, 6 or 8 inches at least apart. And if it's greater than 25 inches and healthy, you might it might support 3 taps. Really, it's better not to do more than 3 taps, although people have done that, and it hasn't hurt the tree. So, but recommended numbers are no more than 3, and for those more than 1, those larger sizes that I mentioned. And in a healthy part of the tree, which some larger trees have rotten spots or damaged spots, which won't give you any sap, so it doesn't, or very, very little, if any. So it doesn't benefit you to put it in those rotten or not so healthy spots. And the healthier spots will heal up more easily. And the time of year to tap really depends on where you live and what the winter's been like. So it can range between mid-February and mid-March to start the season. And if you're in Connecticut, it might be a little bit sooner. If you're in northern Vermont, where the Fairbanks Museum is, it probably will be certainly later than Connecticut in any given year. And also depends on just the weather patterns for any given year. And once you have your hole drilled into the tree, you want to tap or put the spile in. And if you're using a hook like this, make sure to get that on before you put it in. And you tap it in lightly with a hammer, and make sure you don't really hit it very hard or put it in too far, because that could make the tree split, which causes more damage and to the tree, and makes it harder for it to heal, and could lead to disease or other problems for the tree. And the end of the season is when the sap stops running, or if it starts to have a yellowish tint to it, or is cloudy, and that would indicate that the tree is starting to bud out and the leaves are starting to really get going to open up. And so when that happens, it's very similar indications for birch, although birch would be a slightly later season. They probably would overlap a little bit, but slightly later. And when you want to tap the tree is for maples, when the days are above freezing and the nights are below freezing. And for birches, it's when the nights are above freezing and the days are in the 50s or so, which is, of course, slightly later than for maples. And when this end of the season comes along, you want to take all the taps out, and you don't have to fill the holes. The tree will, in a season or two, will heal up or fill in the holes with new wood. And the next season, if you're going to tap the same tree again, make sure you put the new hole, at least 6 inches away from the hole from the prior season, and that will help the tree heal up the holes from tapping them. So you can hang your buckets once you have your taps in, and there are a number of different types. You can see there are metal buckets and plastic buckets made for this that you can hang on the hooks like this or here, and there are plastic bags like this, and what I've used are plastic water jugs like this. You can use any of these types of jugs. Larger operations, especially the big commercial operations, will set up tubing like this, and which will have taps, something like this, in them. And they'll be gravity fed, or in some cases have actually a suction that takes the sap from the trees down to a big collecting tank, and then off to the sugaring house from there. And when the sap really gets running, you might have to empty your containers, your buckets or your jugs or bags at least once a day, or else it'll start overflowing and you'll lose and waste that sap. And in some cases, you might even get enough that you'll have to empty it twice a day. And then once you have your sap, if you don't have a lot at the beginning, especially, you might have to store it, and you want to keep it cool if you're storing it, as cool as possible without freezing. But what I like to do, and what a lot of places and other people do, is they start boiling it right away. And the one good method that I've seen for a home use is something like this: a propane tank and a little burner, and you can set up a pot or a pan of some type outside, because it's possible to do it inside on your stove, but with a proportion of 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup for maple syrup, it's a lot of moisture that is boiled off into the air, and especially in smaller homes, that could lead to issues of condensation on the walls and windows, especially, which can lead to mold and other issues. So it's good to do it outside if you can, or and I've done it inside, but it's good to do it outside if you can. I know other people who have something like this that where you can do it outside and it works well. This is a slightly larger setup with these pans, which is you might have one to get it started and one for finishing your syrup. So, and larger operations might have something like this, where there's a firebox underneath and your pans on top for boiling. And the really bigger operations would have often something called a reverse osmosis machine, which we're not going to get into much here, but it helps take some of the moisture out of the water out of the sap before you get to burning things in a pan or a bucket, and helps keep the sugars from getting burned, which is good, especially for birch, which has fructose mostly instead of sucrose that you find in maple, and fructose is more easily damaged by heat, so you have to boil a birch at a lower temperature. When it's good to keep at least 1.5 to 2 inches of sap or syrup in your container at a time, so you don't scorch your pan or your pot and damage your pot. And when you get to the end of the process, you'll probably want to, especially if you have a smaller amount, you might want to transfer it to a smaller pot or a pan to finish it off. And again, you don't want to concentrate it too much beyond 66, 67% sugar, because the sugar will start to precipitate out of the syrup and crystallize and on the bottom. And you'll know one way to know that it's getting to the end is what's called one way is by when it starts to apron, which is when you put a spoon into the syrup and it coats the spoon or whatever you're using, and doesn't all just fall off like water would do. Another way is with a hygrometer, which is this here, and this actually will float in syrup, and will indicate on it when it gets the right right level, and so that will tell you when it gets the right official 66% sugar level or so. And another issue, when you get near the end, you can see in this image there's this cloudy material here, which is called sugar sand, or sugar sand, and it's not harmful, and you don't really have to filter it out. And what it is some of the minerals that have precipitated out of the sap and syrup along the way of boiling. And but it's easy to filter it out. They make some special materials or filters for filtering it. You can also use other types of filters. A lot of places say it's best to do this hot, but I've done it when it's warm, and it seemed to have worked well. And you can do it before the final boiling to get it down to the final sugar content, and that works the best, I found, and that's what others have recommended as well. And then when it's done, you make sure to store it in clean containers, or else things can, mold and bacteria can start growing in it. But if you've boiled it, so it's killed anything that was in there, and if you store it in clean containers, you shouldn't have a problem. And here's one resource that from UVM Extension that provides a lot of good additional information. And I can show you that right now. I can try and show you. Yeah, it's right here. And it has a lot of good information about conferences and statistics, and other resources for maple sugaring especially. And so thanks for that's the end of my presentation. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll make sure to get this shared with everybody. And thanks for tuning in.